All right. Today's exercise we're going to be going over demo number 4 with output files and formats, and we will do this in several separate videos. This first video will identify how to prep your work to make sure that it's ready for creating our output static image angles from Blender. We'll have a couple videos that will follow this, including how to take those images and then put them together in Photoshop to make a finished 4-image grid. After that, we will do another video on showing how to properly export your model out of Blender. And then our final video will identify how to upload your work into the Augment system and use its software to be able to prep the file ready for display. So let's get started with our first demonstration with creating these static image views. So there are a few things that we need to go over before we actually start doing that. And that requires us to check our model and our scene to make sure everything is organized the way we want it. So the first things that we'll check off here as part of our checklist, first is make sure that your models and lighting are all positioned the way that you want them in your scenes. The easiest way to check that is to change your viewport shading option down here on the bottom and to flip that into rendered. And very quickly that'll give you an on-screen preview of roughly what it will look like when your lighting is active, your textures are active inside your scene. That way you know basically how it's going to affect everything. So if your lighting's in the right position and your models are placed accordingly, and you look in each viewport to check that. Always check in quad view. I don't recommend working with looking at a model in just one viewport. The user perspective is the typical one. It's always good to look in the viewports that show you a straight-on perspective or orthographic perspective without any distortion from the viewing area. So you look over your model and make sure that everything is positioned correctly, lights look good, and all. Now I'm going to switch back to my viewport back to solid shade. And then we're also going to check something else. We're going to go over to our outliner panel over here on the right side of the screen. And what we want to do here is actually look through the list of objects and elements that are in our 3D scene and make sure that there's nothing here that does not need to be included in our final render or our final export for later. So we very carefully look up and down the list, make sure there's no objects that we aren't using. You can very quickly select and click down through the list to make sure as you select them that they are visibly present inside the model. If you select an item and it does not appear inside your scene, then that may be a good time to get rid of that particular item. You may also want to check whenever you click on your items to make sure that these icons are all turned on, that the eyeball for visibility in the editing modes are turned on, that the camera icon is turned on. When the camera is turned on, if you don't recall, that allows that object or thing to be rendered in the final static image or render output. So if those aren't turned on, then you may be having trouble visibly seeing objects in your scene. So make sure all those are on when you go through each of your elements. And again, if you don't see something that you're clicking on, it's probably off screen somewhere and will need to be deleted. Anytime you find an object you don't need, select it in the outliner, move your mouse out into one of your viewing ports, and hit X on the keyboard and then click delete, and that will drop the item off of your list. There are some rare circumstances where Blender does not recognize deletion of some items, in which case sometimes they don't even have visibility inside the scene anyway. Okay, so we check our scene to make sure that nothing is strangely out of place, that we don't have any strange models or forms or elements floating in our scene. The other thing that we'll want to check is to make sure that our textures are showing properly on our objects. So for that, I'll switch back to either, not material, but rendered, to review my objects to see how they each look. Now, the one thing I recommend when looking at objects inside of Blender is sometimes it's good to use the isolation mode button or shortcut key so that you can review one object by itself in your scene at a time. So if I wanted to look at Suzanne, the monkey head, I could select it in the outliner, and then I would hit the / key on my number pad on a normal extended keyboard. And when I do that, it will separate out all other items in my scene and leave just the monkey head behind. And so I can carefully review it, make sure that everything looks okay. So far the texture looks fine on the monkey, so I'm not concerned about her. I may also want to check this other object that I have listed in my outliner as a Bezier curve. And to do that, I'll need to exit the isolation mode for the monkey. So I'll click that same / key again. And this time, I will click it for the Bezier curve. Oh. And you may notice that I actually have multiple items selected. So when you do that with the / both items become visible at the same time. That's actually okay, but I really just want to look at this item right here. So always make sure that you have just one item highlighted at a time when you're isolating. Sometimes it's good to go to solid mode and do that, and then switch back to render to double check it. So I double check my textures on my items. That one looks pretty good. This is meant to be a very reflective item sort of surface, so it's looking pretty good so far. And the last one that I will need to check over is going to be the metaball system. And so I'll click on the lead M ball right here from my list. And that will keep them all highlighted. And I'm going to check that to see what it looks like. Okay, so immediately looking at these close-ups and other viewports of the metaballs, that the texture mapping is not correct at all. So this is something that we would want to correct at this stage in the game. You should know that most items in Blender, if they have not been converted into a mesh, the texture mapping may not go on correctly onto those items. Also, those objects don't become very editable inside the interface. So to do that, especially with metaballs, there are certain items that you can convert to mesh objects, and that's also important, by the way, to do that before you even export work out into the Augment system, because Augment does not recognize non-mesh items. Non-mesh objects that you can create in Blender include things from your add command like curves, surfaces, metaballs, and text. None of those things can be rendered inside of an augmented reality system. They must be converted into a mesh surface. So to do that with our metaball object, I'm going to go back to solid mode, and I'm going to select all of my metaballs inside of my scene, and I'm just going to hold shift and grab each one in the outliner. So they should all be highlighted orange. And then I'm going to go down here to my object mode and go into object from the menu, slide all the way up to the top, and go to convert to. And from there, I'm going to use this option, mesh from curve. Oh, and I don't think I can do that while I'm in object isolation mode. There we go. Yeah, make sure you exit object isolation mode, otherwise it won't let you convert the object. Okay, go back up and do mesh. And you also notice when you convert objects that if there were multiples, like the metaball, it just converts them all down into one main object together. So now I can actually apply my mesh or my texture to this object more appropriately. So I'm going to go into my edit mode and select my whole object, go to my shading UV tab, and go to unwrap. Now we can check it. I haven't marked a seam on it, so I'm not sure if it's actually going to produce the proper looking render of the material at this time. And sure enough, it's not quite accurate. It was a start though. So the easiest thing to do is just to quickly add a texture somewhere across the back. So I'm going to rotate in the top view to spin my object around. And I'm doing that so that I can just quickly draw a seam here across the front orthographic perspective. So I'm going to zoom in, deselect everything, use my edge selection from the base, and I'm just going to grab a collection of connected edges. I'm not going to create any special shapes for this particular seam. Even though you can create independent shapes with seams, you can actually cut out entire sections with them. Okay, so we got a nice long seam that runs across the back of our object now. One long internet connected line. Mark it from over here on the Shading UV tab. Now we're going to reselect everything by hitting A a couple times. And we'll go back over here to UVs, go to Unwrap, and unwrap it. Alright, now when I go to Rendered, we should see a better application of the texture to the overall surface. Yep, so it stretched it all the way around the object now, so we're in pretty good position with that. Alright, so now I'll go back out to object mode, exit isolation, and I'm going to rotate my object in my top view back around the way it's supposed to be. Okay, so that's an important step that you need to make. Now there are other things in my scene that are not correctly converted into other objects. This object that I've selected right now is actually made from a curve and a modifier, as you notice in my outliner up here in the upper right. It is not recognized as a mesh object yet. So that's something that I also need to convert into a flattened object. So I'm going to apply the modifier by going to the property panel for that object first. And obviously it's telling me I can't apply it on a curve. That's fine. We just need to convert our curve into a mesh at this time. So we'll do the same thing we did with the metaballs. Have it selected, go to Object, Convert, Mesh from Curve. Alright. And by proxy when I did that, it went ahead and flattened the modifier effect to the object, which is fine in our case. We're done editing that object. It wouldn't be good if I still needed to do editing. Then I should have added my curve or my modifier to the curve after I converted my curve into a mesh. Okay, so now we have those things rigged and in place. Now we can begin the next steps where we actually create still image outputs from Blender. So this process requires us to go in and create several things. For our four angle views of our sculpture, we're going to make a front view, a side view, or two side views, a left and a right, and a 3/4 off angle view from the front. So we'll start with making those. So the first couple things we need to set up to make sure that's good to go. So let's first make sure that our object is placed properly on top of the ground plane inside of our Blender system. Now you can notice that I can see grid markers through the user perspective window, and my model sits under that grid markers. So that tells me that it's actually under the ground plane, and if I look in my front and right views, I can see that parts of my object rest below this green line in the right and the red line in the front. Those two lines in these views indicate the ground level. So when it's off like that, we need to bring it to where it rests right on top. So I'm going to select all my items, hit A a couple times. My widget on screen is turned off, so I'm going to go ahead and turn it back on down here on the 3D menu. If yours is not showing after you select something, that little 3D green, red, and blue widget, it's because the icon's been deactivated and grayed out. Click on it and it'll pop right back up. I'm going to drag the blue arrow in the front view to pull the object straight up and bring it just above the ground plane. Alright. Now we got our object kind of up on screen. Okay, so now what we're going to do to get the proper export images from the system, we do need to work with the camera, because the camera is the item that actually controls what gets rendered. Whatever it sees is what goes out of the system. So I'm going to go over to my outliner, make sure my camera is selected, and there it is, popped up in my screen. And to turn on my camera view, I'm going to hit 0 on the number pad, and that will show me an exact view from the camera. Next thing I'm going to do is now we're going to go and edit some properties for the camera. And actually, you know what? Before we edit those properties, there's one thing I want to drop in the scene that's kind of important at this stage. What we want the camera to do to make it easier to be able to navigate the camera around our scene, because right now when I move the camera, it always stays pointed in one direction and at one angle. I would have to go into multiple angles to try to adjust it to make it look where I want it to, but that gets a little frustrating after a minute. So what we're going to tell the camera to do is to look at an object within our sculptural area. No matter where it rotates, it will always look at that object. So we're going to add a reference object to our sculpture that's invisible that the camera will point at. So to do that, we'll go down to our Add command down here on the 3D menu, and then we're going to go up to something called Empty and insert an empty cube. Now when an empty cube drops in your scene, it is invisible. It has no visible properties at all. It looks hollowed out, no walls, no rendered edges, and that is what is considered an empty object. It's often used in animation or composite video editing and special effects to help rig and control animated movements so that the control handle or the an empty object does not need to be seen or rendered in the final work. So I'm going to reposition this object strategically. I need to place it to where it's approximately at the center of my overall sculptural design. So I'm going to coordinate in each of my viewports where that box needs to go. So I'm going to change its height to where it sort of fits within the sort of rectangular area from this view. I'm going to make sure that its position in my top view is sort of centralized, again within sort of the representative area perimeter that my sculpture fits. I'm going to look over here, and I'm kind of imagining that there's a bounding box that goes around my entire scene and goes from edge of object to edge of object to edge of object. And I'm just going to make sure that, again, this is positioned centrally. And that looks pretty good for now. Alright, now what we're going to do is go back to our camera, so I'm going to reselect it in the outliner, and we're going to tell the camera to connect to this object or look at it. So what we're going to do is use a constraint for our camera to do that. So let's go to Properties, and in the Properties panel on the right there's a chain link icon with your camera active. Click on that chain link and we're going to add a constraint. There are many kinds in here, but the one that we want to play with is going to be one called Track 2. Track 2 is the one that will tell the camera to simply look at an object and move its viewport towards that object. So when we do that, the settings come up for Track 2, and we're going to change Target. We're going to click on the Object option and click on the Empty that's in our outliner. We're going to change a couple options to make sure our camera actually looks at the object, because right now it's looking straight down after changing that option, so that's not good. And that's all based on these settings inside here. It's looking at the Y value position of the object, or the Y direction. So we need to switch that to -Z, gets us started. And then we're going to change the up value to Y. And then we're also going to make sure to have it checked for target Z. So now our camera appears to be looking at the object. So let's test it. Back over here in our top view, I'm going to click and drag on the widget for my camera and move it. And so notice as I move the camera around that it is constantly looking straight at the object. It also makes a little blue dotted reference line that goes from the camera to the center of the object to let me know what it's looking at and which direction or vector it's looking at it from. So this is really helpful. Alright, so now what we're going to do is get our camera positioned to look from our first angle of view, which is our front view. So I'm going to move my camera to right about here in my top view, because that looks front head-on at my object design. And you need to make sure to determine a front perspective to give us an idea of what we're looking at. Even if your design does not necessarily have a front viewpoint. So I'll get it positioned over here in the top view to look straight on from the front of my object, and then I'll come to my front view and drag the camera down, because what we want to start with is a head-on perspective angle of our object. We can also look and coordinate in the right side view to make sure it's looking straight across. That little dotted blue line that extends from the camera to your reference object in the center should be relatively straight when getting these straight views. Now that we have that established, we notice that our camera does show a lot of visual distortion in the little preview box of what it's going to capture. So we need to make some adjustments to the camera itself at this stage. So let's go down to our camera properties and switch to the video camera property, and we're going to change up some of the lens options. So let's go to orthographic. We're going to switch it from perspective to orthographic, and that will remove all perspective distortion from our lens, which is what we want for showing off our sculpture. Perspective's great if you're just rendering a natural looking 2D scene or an animation. That makes it look more natural. But orthographic is more for portfolio or showing off an object as it should appear. So we get that rigged. Now when you switch to orthographic, you do need to change the scale to zoom in and out on your object to fill your scene. Now this is relative right now. What we're going to do next after we set this is also change the shape of this render box, because this is not appropriate for what we're going to use it for. This render box is set right now for what is typically used for HD video. This is a 16:9 wide video box, which is great for animation or video. But we're switching, and we're going to use this output to print later as part of our Photoshop file. So right now we just need it to be changed. So we're going to leave our settings alone over here for now, and we're going to now go over to our other property for the still camera icon for render. So we're going to change some of the render settings. So these are things we will switch before we send out our static images. So under render, change the display option to new window. That'll allow whenever we make a render, it won't overtake our Blender screen, which is what happens if you leave it on image editor. So I'll go to new window. Under dimensions, we're going to change the resolution values, and we're going to go, instead of 1920 by 1080, we're going to use 850 by 1100. And you can flip-flop these values or flip these values accordingly depending on the design of your sculpture. So if your sculpture is more long and tall, you should use a box that's vertical. But if your sculpture is more short and wide, then you need to make something that's more horizontal. And mine's more short and wide, so I need to flip these values. So I'm going to go and change my X to 1100 and switch my Y to 850. And that'll make a box that more appropriately fits around my design. I also want to make sure that resolution is set to 100%, so it's a high quality output. And then I'm going to slide down on the settings and go to output. Now down in output, we need to switch this file format from PNG to JPEG, depending on what your system is already set to, but it should be set for JPEG. Highlight RGB and set the quality slider to 100%. Okay, now what we're going to do is go back into our camera properties for the video camera, and we're just going to zoom back in a little because I got a big border here. So I'm just going to come back in and go to orthographic scale and click and drag on that to blow up the scene a little bit more. And I want my object to fill in this box. It should not be cropped like this or even partially, or it shouldn't be like this. Make sure that it contains just the elements of your scene inside the box. Alright, now we have that set up. We can go ahead and create our first save file. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And to do that, we're going to go to our properties panel over here again and go to the render icon, which is the still camera. Scroll back up if you're down at the bottom still, and then click on the render button. And slowly but surely you should see develop on screen the full image render of your scene. Now Blender will do this in pieces depending on the speed of your computer. It may do this render very quickly, or it may do it slowly. But now mine is complete, and I can zoom in and out with my mouse scroll if I want to see the entire scene. And I'm going to go ahead and save this once it's done rendering it like that. So I'll go down to the bottom of this window and hit Image, and go to Save as Image. And what I'm going to set here is the location first for this save. So I'm going to send it to my desktop, or actually I'm going to make a folder for it. So I'm going to go to my desktop, and I'm going to make a new folder. And I'll call it my Blender exports, or Blender stills. Go into that folder. I'm going to change the name of my file. Now I'm going to save it as the direction that the still image was based on. So it was a front view, so I'm going to title it front. Alright, and then there are save as image options down here in the lower left. These should be the same as what you rigged inside the system, so you don't need to change anything. So go ahead and hit save as image, and that'll output one image. Now I'm going to close this window so I can get my next one. So to get your right and left views, it's real easy. Just go into your top orthographic view in your grid and drag your camera around till it faces straight on from the right. And again, review when you get to that angle to make sure that your sculpture is in full view and it's not cut off inside the screen somewhere. If it's cut off, always go back to your camera property and change the orthographic scale slightly to make sure it's all in there. Alright, so I rotated my camera around to that side. I'm ready for another render, so I'll go back to my render property, hit render, and it will generate that perspective angle for me. And again, the speed of your computer will determine how quickly it renders out this system. So I'll go down to Image, Save as Image, and change this file name. I'll call it the left side. And now I'm going to come back into my top view and drag the camera around to the other side and do the other side of the sculpture and do render again. Alright, save that one. I'll call that my right. And then the final view is the 3/4 view. So we're going to do this by pulling the camera at a 45-degree angle to the front of our object. So you can either look at it from this part of the front or this side. It's kind of up to you based on the details that you see inside the camera viewport, what's more important to you, and what looks more interesting. So again, like you can notice here that now my camera is kind of off-center because of the angle. That part of my sculpture is outside of screen. So what I may want to do is move my object around in my top view and slide it ever so slightly to try to get my object in full view, or my sculpture in full view in the screen. So notice as I move it, the camera does follow that object. So I'm just moving it over just enough to keep this from getting clipped off. Now I've got it from the front, but when you're getting a 3/4 view, sometimes it's good to also get a little bit of an overhead perspective. So switch to your camera and go to the front view and drag the camera upward with the blue arrow. And we get a little bit of definition by changing the angle of it. Now I'm a little too close again. I'm actually going to zoom out with my orthographic scale to make the correction there. And we're looking good. Alright, so now I can do that one. So again, lifting the camera up a little bit to get a little more overhead angle and throwing it off angle at 45 degrees is a good way to see more definition of the design of the sculpture to show. So now I'll go back to render. We'll render this image as well. And again, pick one of those front angles that shows more interesting details that you prefer people to see when you're showing it off. And I'll call this one 3/4. Okay. And now to check our work, we're going to actually go to our folder and make sure that everything looks good when you always check everything when you export to make sure that the work that you get out of the system is what you put into it. So I'm going to look at each of my images and pull up a preview on screen. You can always preview a file on a Mac by selecting the file and hitting spacebar, and that'll pull up a preview image. So right now everything looks good for that one. This one looks good, that one looks good, and the 3/4 looks great. Okay, so this concludes this part of the tutorial. In the next part, we will take these images and bring them into Photoshop to make a 4-grid 8.5 by 11 for printing. That image will also serve as our tracker image to upload into Augment for scanning. All right, get back with you on the next exercise.